Welcome to Michael Brooks Show live stream event. Joining us now is really, I know this would it'll make me feel uncomfortable if I heard it, but the man is legendary in my estimation. He's the former CNN Jerusalem bureau chief, reporter for CNN for many years, Al Jazeera, where you can find his work primarily now, where he is an independent journalist and consultant, and you hear him frequently on this program. Mike Hanna, thanks so much for being here.
Nice to be with you, Michael.
Mike, we're talking about South Africa going to the polls tomorrow. It's 25 years after the liberation, the defeat of apartheid. We're now in our fourth president in a democratic South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. Can you remind everybody of how he came to power in the African National Congress and what he represents in South African politics heading into tomorrow's elections and how it looks for him?
Well, Ramaphosa is a fascinating figure in a number of ways. During the apartheid years, he was a very powerful trade union leader. He basically held the unions together when they came under the full force of the apartheid regime. Then with the advent of democracy, he became a very successful businessman, became basically a multi-billionaire. And then he moved away from politics for a period of time. Many believe that he was disgusted with the corruption as he saw it within the Zuma government. But then he came back into politics. The ANC finally recalled Jacob Zuma. In other words, they sacked him as president. And Cyril Ramaphosa won that particular ANC election, and now, of course, is the country's president.
And how has his tenure been? I mean, he's been in office about a year, and I just want to throw a comparison out. And correct me if I'm wrong on both of these counts. Inside the African National Congress, it's my read that there is a sort of, in my words, almost a kind of right-wing sort of chauvinist populism with kind of crony capitalism exemplified by people like Jacob Zuma, who's still a factor. Then there's a left that still exists in the party that wants to sort of complete the necessary economic transformation that has not happened in the 25 years after the political end of apartheid. And then there's figures like Cyril Ramaphosa, who in some ways, I mean, if I was to analog him, then of course I'm not comparing him at all as a leader. He's a significantly more interesting, impressive, and historically important person. But in the sense that maybe there is still a type of Macron or third way style kind of leadership trying to kind of get back to the centrist politics of the 1990s. I mean, is that way of understanding the different components of the ANC fair? And does Ramaphosa fit in that sort of Clinton mold, as it were?
One of the really important things to remember is that the ANC is and has always been part of a tripartite alliance, an alliance with the Congress of South African Trade Unions and the South African Communist Party. Now, this alliance is actually what made the ANC through the apartheid years. It's what brought it to power. Cyril Ramaphosa was a central part of that alliance in terms of maneuvering the various factions to keep them on side for a long period of time. His business career has led to ructions with the trade union movement in particular. Cyril seen very much as a poacher turned gamekeeper in that particular regard. But still, he is a man who comes out of the ANC culture. One could call it an old-style ANC culture, one that was rooted in a very grassroots level of organization. It always was a very democratic movement, coming from the bottom up rather than the top down. That changed during the years that Zuma was in power. Those apparatchiks that you refer to who kind of surrounded Zuma, but ensured that they kept their hands on whatever spigots would pour out, whatever profits that could happen. And the political power was largely taken away from ANC rank and file. Now, there is a sense among many that I've spoken to that because of Ramaphosa's history and because of his understanding of the ANC culture, this is something that he's pushing to go back to. And that is why this election is so crucial, because it will show to a very large degree to what extent the presence of Ramaphosa in the ANC leadership for the past year has had an impact on a party that had been leaking support for a large number of years under Jacob Zuma.
Is this relevant then in light of, and then we will get to the EFF and the DA and maybe actually what Zuma's up to, but to kind of, I mean, there's two more things though on this Ramaphosa theme. I want to just actually, can we deal with one on its own? Because I think, one of the things that certainly is highly concerning, even for outside, observers, obviously, who have a, labor-oriented, justice-oriented perspective, is not just that Ramaphosa made this fortune in the private sector, though that does raise eyebrows, but also the Marikana Massacre in 2012, which I know you reported on very well and very importantly at the time. Can you explain to us what that event was and how that has shaped some of the concerns about Ramaphosa and potentially how he's tried, as you say, in this effort to kind of reestablish the incredible historical legacy of the ANC, how he's trying to sort of repair that specific damage?
Well, that Marikana was where the political leader and the businessman collided. Marikana was a mine which was holding a series of strikes. The police were called in, shots were fired, a large number of people were killed, many more were injured. Cyril Ramaphosa did not directly own the mine, but he certainly had a big stake in the company that did hold it. And he came under intense criticism for not stopping the police from coming in and for not reacting immediately to the brutal way in which the strikers were put down. Now, Ramaphosa has apologized subsequently, repeatedly, but that was still a major stain on his career in the eyes of many who'd seen him fight from the trade union side and were absolutely aghast that he would employ, as it was seen, the tactics that he resisted against so fiercely when he was a trade union leader. So that was a major impact on Ramaphosa. But to get back to the political career, and once again, this is something that one has got to understand about the ANC. There was a long-term thought process involved in how the ANC organized itself. I was present at a meeting way back in Lusaka in the 1980s when the ANC was still banned. The first wave of political prisoners had been released, and they went to Lusaka to meet the full ANC leadership for the first time in decades. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa was there, and very clearly in the discussions that were being held there is that the succession was very clearly established. Nelson Mandela was going to be the first democratic president. Thabo Mbeki was going to take over from Nelson Mandela, and Mbeki's successor was going to be Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, that was organized, that was all laid out. Everybody within the ANC in the months and years to come were well aware that was the way things were going to happen. But what happened within the ANC was a virtual revolution led by that man, Julius Malema, who was then a youth leader in the ANC, and who basically put his entire backing behind Jacob Zuma. Thabo Mbeki was recalled. The whole plans for succession were thrown away. Many stalwart ANC people walked away from a party that they no longer saw as representing them or their interests, or indeed protecting the interests of the country. So to understand that Cyril Ramaphosa has not come from nowhere. It's not as though he's a guy who went out and made money and then decides, I'm going to try politics now. He was deeply rooted in the process of leadership within the ANC. And when Nelson Mandela came up out of prison, the man who was next to him all the time carrying his briefcase was Cyril Ramaphosa. He was being groomed at that stage to take over as president following Thabo Mbeki. As I said, those plans all went helter-skelter. And Cyril Ramaphosa himself went into business with the blessing of the African National Congress. This was a process that they understood, that they thought was necessary. Once again, part of the argument being that why should we not make money as others do? It's not as though we are the ANC that we have to live like monks. But there was this long-term planning, this long foresight in place, which was all thrown out of the window when the party ruptured with the election of Jacob Zuma and the activity of particularly the youth cadres headed by Julius Malema.
Well, that opens up. I mean, there's three different things then maybe I'd like you to hit if you can. So there's the Thabo Mbeki era, which we've talked about a little bit before for patrons, which I find fascinating. And I guess maybe, I mean, let's start there a little bit. I mean, Thabo has reemerged. He's not actually, as my understanding is, he hasn't campaigned for the ANC since his deposition, since he was deposed as president. And he never campaigned for Zuma. He has been on the campaign trail supporting Ramaphosa, but he's also made some very sharp criticisms of figures like Zuma or Ace Mashuli or others who are sort of associated and accused of significant corruption. However, you know, part of my understanding is how Zuma was able to leverage against Mbeki was that the perception that this great bottom-up democratic tripartite tradition had already been sort of undermined by a combination of sort of probably global demands, which every nation state, particularly a developing nation state, would have a hard time resisting in terms of capital and where it would and wouldn't go and what it demanded of places and the limits, in Thomas Friedman's sort of evocative and grotesque phrase, the golden straitjacket. But also that Mbeki was, you know, noted by, seems like everybody acknowledges his brilliance and his strategic mind, but someone who didn't have a sort of broad counsel, and that Zuma was able to harness those resentments, but not for a process of kind of left transformation, but for sort of demagoguery and populism. I mean, is that kind of read right in terms of how those lanes split?
Yes, that is very accurate. Mbeki had many talents, but one of them was not being a public figure. He was seen by many in the ANC as cool and standoffish. They compared him unfavorably with dancing, singing Jacob Zuma, friends to all, the ultimate populist. But one must also remember that during the years that Mbeki was in power, the huggy feeling of the Mandela era was over. The Rainbow Nation was now coming to face with the reality that you in power, you have got to make things change. You've got to make things happen. Mbeki was the nuts and bolts man. Mandela was the let's all live together in peace and happiness leader. Mbeki was the one who actually put the tires back on the car. Now, he spent a lot of time doing that. There was a lot of focus on rebuilding infrastructure, on dealing with very basic things like getting running water to each home, getting education for every kid up until the age of 16. Now, these were massive undertakings. The brutalization to the society after decades of apartheid doesn't just go away in a few years. So Mbeki was very largely occupied with this broadening his gap with the public at large, who weren't seeing immediate results, because these are not the things that happen overnight. These are things that take years and years to put in place to rebuild the infrastructure. And in a way, he was caught napping as well by the young populists like Malema, who their backing of Jacob Zuma was very much what they saw as an important factor in terms of stirring the masses up against what they saw as an uncaring leadership that was not producing results. All those building of infrastructure, all of that was happening then in the Mbeki years, slowed to a crawl and then virtually ended under Zuma, because Zuma was so busy keeping his eyes on his own fortune and on those around him that long-term infrastructure planning fell away to a large extent. Now, this, of course, is a challenge that has fallen down to Cyril Ramaphosa for the second time in 25 years to have to begin to rebuild, to create an infrastructure that had not been there in the first place. So this is a long-term process. The one bit of good news I think that we have seen in the year that Ramaphosa has been in power is some very able and talented people have come back into the ANC, either brought back by Ramaphosa himself or deciding that this is more like the ANC that they were part of. People like Tito Mboweni, an absolute financial giant. He'd been driven out by Zuma. He's now back within government. Pravin Gordhan, who had a terrible relationship with Zuma, one of the most successful tax collectors anywhere in the universe, he's back. So these are very important signs, I think, that those who actually made the engine run are coming back into government now that Cyril Ramaphosa is there. That is the one bright sign in what has been a pretty bleak 8 years.
What about Julius Malema? I mean, I've heard the economic freedom fighters. I mean, I've seen him speak. He makes some seems to me, absolutely brilliant and correct points. Although I wonder. I hear him talk about Fanon and Marx, but you can also see other ways in which some of the rhetoric kind of mirrors, just this sort of spread of a certain type of right-wing populism, although way more justified in the South African case. But what do you make of Malema? Do you think he'll have an impact on these elections, as he already has in the discourse? I guess this is evidenced by Ramaphosa embracing what seems to me a very kind of moderate and sensible and centrist approach to land redistribution. I mean, what is going to be the impact of the economic freedom fighters?
Well, that is going to be one of the key issues. I think the most problematic thing about Malema himself is his falling back on a fundamental racism in terms of dealing his political philosophy. He makes much of the white versus black struggle completely anathema to, once again, the old guard ANC, to whom non-racism was a fundamental part of the movement and should have been a fundamental part of a democratic country. Malema has gone back to that. He eggs on Jacob Zuma to go back to his very tribal roots as well. So you had something that the ANC had fought against for a long time coming back into the political discourse. And Julius Malema has made hay out of that particular one. You're quite right that Ramaphosa sees him as a major threat. He saw what happened to Mbeki when Malema was within the ANC. He realizes that Malema could be even more damaging outside the ANC with his own political movement. So yes, he did make what, and you correctly say, very moderate and centrist moves in terms of land distribution. That's partly as a sop to attract those who support Malema. But in terms of his broad public appeal, and here's the issue, the ANC did disastrously in the local elections 2 years ago. They lost 3 major cities. They lost Johannesburg, they lost Cape Town, they lost Nelson Bay area. So they were really hammered at the elections. But the full weight of support did not go to the EFF, it did not go to Malema. It largely went to the Democratic Alliance. Mm-hmm. And so in that election, at a time when you would have expected to see their support spike, it actually didn't. It flattened out a little bit. And I think that's going to be one of the key things to watch in this election now, is to what extent Malema is all sound and fury with a political support that is loud, but in terms of numbers, minimal. And I think that is one of the key issues to look at in the elections.
So the vote went to the Democratic Alliance. I did a segment on Mmusi Maimane. We were joking, and I think journalist Ben Fogel, I think, initially came up with this, that Mmusi Maimane is the Beto O'Rourke of South Africa. Clearly molded. And I believe that the ANC, I believe the consulting firm Greenberg Quinlan Rosner, which in the 90s consulted the ANC, and as they advise a lot of Democratic and other sort of centrist parties across the globe, I think that they've moved to the DA. The DA, my understanding is the historical roots of it were in the sort of official liberal opposition in parliament to the apartheid government. And then the sort of absorbed, when the Nationalist Party, the Apartheid Party, collapsed after the fall of apartheid, it absorbed some of those folks as well. And then they've settled on this, Mmusi Maimane, this young leader who, of course, again, like Beto O'Rourke, there's a degree of charisma, there's a degree of fluency, but it seems that it's very much a kind of what does private business want in South Africa? What is the sort of agenda of capital, and without any of the historical relationships to, certainly any of the modes of liberation of the ANC. Where do they, and also they've made a big argument on competence, and in some of the areas that they've controlled, they haven't necessarily, as an example, managed the Cape Town province so well. And, now that you have Ramaphosa back in charge of the ANC, it seems like the kind of technocracy argument goes out the window.
Yes, I think that all those points are pretty accurate. I mean, my mommy comes largely from Central Casting. He is there because the Democratic Alliance recognized that it was still carrying its history. It has been the official opposition party throughout the years of apartheid. Many argued very strongly that it gave the apartheid government a semblance of democracy by actually agreeing to sit in a racially divided parliament. So it carried with it the weight of that baggage, and it didn't help that in the post-94 years, the leadership was virtually always white. It was seen as the party, as you put it, of the old-style opposition, who many regarded as sellouts by taking part in that parliamentary system, and then joined by those who moved away from the National Party in the years after 94. So certainly that is a problem for the Democratic Alliance. They are facing another new problem in this election, and that is that they are getting slammed by a leader like Ramaphosa, who is attracting the rank and file, the very base on which the Democratic Alliance was built. Their comfort with big business, their claims to technocratic competence, being called into question, as you say, by the way in which they've governed the major cities such as Cape Town. But they are being caught on both sides now by a leader like Cyril Ramaphosa, because he's pulling at their support from the one side. They are absolutely terrified about this election coming up now, because this is, in a way, we've said it time and time again with the Democratic Alliance in its various forms, it's a make or break time. Can they ever be sustainable? Can they ever threaten to take over government at any stage? That answer has been a very loud, a very vociferous no. And many would believe that it's got even less likely now that the Democratic Alliance can affect any form of useful opposition that has the threat of assuming power at some stage in the future. I think that the opposition is going to come from lesser-known bodies, bodies like the Bantu Holomisa's UDM, which did incredibly well for such a small party in the local elections, and particularly in the areas of his power. And there is going to be that kind of process in terms of alliances, new alliances possibly forming. Now, to get to the actual vote, it's highly unlikely that the ANC will not win. It's the size of their win that is critical for the ANC's future, and to give a reflection of a vote of confidence in Cyril Ramaphosa as a leader. Anything less than 50%, they'd require an alliance. It's very, very difficult for them to form an alliance. Most believe that they will get way over 50% of the vote, and possibly up until 63, 64% of the vote. But this all depends on another key issue, and this is the key issue in the elections, that people go out and vote. It's not a degree of voter apathy that has happened in South Africa. It's a sense of disgust for the political process that has not provided the results that people hope for. If there's a high percentage poll, the ANC will do very well. If there is not a high percentage poll, well, that's another issue completely.
As a final question, I mean, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that Thabo Mbeki would quote Langston Hughes, or Will It Explode poem at times when he was talking about the prospects for South Africa's future. And even if we took, and I'll just, it's my sense, I mean, I would imagine that if I was in South Africa, I would vote ANC. I think the EFF is making some very important points, but I also think you're right that there's an essentialism, which is, ultimately just very much not my politics anywhere, shape, or form. That being said, I mean, it's one thing to have a restoration out of this, crony capitalism, rampant corruption, and a refocus on rebuilding the legendary capacity of this party, and also kind of demonstrating, an efficiency and a competence to draw investment and capital and so on, which is the nature of the game we're in right now, for sure. At the same time, it isn't just South Africa that's having, increasing difficulties and challenges with extreme inequality and other, variables, let alone compounded by the fact that it was under this ruthless apartheid obscenity for decades. If Ramaphosa returns to power, what is the path for the second liberation? The liberation of, again, not redistributing wealth to, from traditional capital monopolies to friends of the president, but redistributing wealth from the wealthy to the poor, from, and generating real gains so that this situation, this incredible accomplishment, is not endangered in the future.
Well, the key, once again, is that rebuilding of the infrastructure, which, as I said, has slowed down and virtually come to a halt under Jacob Zuma. That is an absolute key issue. Those basic fundamental issues like free water, clean water, good education up to the age of 16, all of these things are absolutely critical to the development of the society as a whole. Rebuilding the economy, critical point. South Africa was so minerally dependent that it became basically prey to international market forces. The rebuilding of that economy with a view to an economy that offers equality to all. Now, that is the other key issue that's going to be a very tough hurdle for Ramaphosa to climb, and that is to create an equality within an economic system that has been completely unequal for decades and has remained so throughout the years of so-called liberation since '94. Now, once again, the only gleam of hope here is that you do have some people who come back into government who are well aware of those factors and who have the skills and the foresight and the experience to be able to start to get these things working. One of the things that you'll see, for example, is a pruning down of a cabinet that grew to more than 40 people under Jacob Zuma, for example, to give as many jobs to friends as possible and to give them little parts of the banquet to feed on. One of the first things you'll see with Ramaphosa, I'm convinced, is a lean, much leaner cabinet, very less portfolios, concentrated in hands of those who are actually good at what they do rather than based on their relationship with the president at the time. But it's a really long, hard haul. Once again, to kind of expect the overnight turnaround, that's just impossible. But what one would be looking for is, first of all, to see whether the ANC can get a solid base in this election, whether it can get a signal that the bulk of people are prepared to back it politically. That will give us a standing to be able to make the changes within the economy, within the society that need to be made. There's going to be some very serious discussion with the allied partners, the South African Communist Party, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. They felt that they've been cut out of governance for a long period of time. They will want to be coming back in. They will want to have their influence felt. It's why the ANC was successful in the past, because it listened to the voices of those who were truly disenfranchised and also those who had a stake in what the future was, such as the trade unions, such as the Communist Party. So all of these factors coming together, Cyril Ramaphosa is the one person who has got the experience and the ability to bring together these various elements that would be required to begin to turn around a society that's been absolutely bludgeoned for the years under Jacob Zuma. It's a long haul, it's a tall order, but out of the ANC leadership, Ramaphosa is the one who could possibly get it right. And the key issue, once again, will be the size of his cabinet and who he puts into those cabinet positions. Are they going to be able? Are they going to be experienced? Or are they going to be, once again, it's jobs for the friends, it's jobs for those who stayed in politics long enough, and this is now their reward? Now, that will be the key issue, to take a look at those. But first of all, it's a very simple thing. If Ramaphosa and the ANC are serious about change, the first signal is going to be removing jobs from cabinet and getting more jobs elsewhere.
Mike Hanna, as always, we appreciate your time so much. Please watch all of Mike Hanna's reports on Al Jazeera. They're readily available, of course, on television, also on YouTube, where he reports from both the D.C., our late Roman capital under Donald Trump, and also the United Nations. Mike, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Great talking to you as always.
Take care. My pleasure. Thank you. All right, folks, we'll be back here live in about 35 minutes.